Chapter 4: The Spider and the Admiral. A small square stands directly in front of the Renaissance Royal Palace, high on the rocks above Monaco. The cathedral is only a few yards away, and alleyways lead off the square. Some of the unsung but excellent eating places in the Principality can be found in these small streets, while the square itself is a popular haunt of tourists. Usually, the instamatic Dr. Scholl-sandaled tourists gather in the square to watch the changing of the guard, which has a light operetta, toy soldierish air to it. The sentry boxes are painted in white and red, and the guards themselves could have stepped straight from the pages of some Ruritanian novel. Most visitors think it charming. Older residents regard the tourists as vulgar folk who have come from another planet. On the Mediterranean side of the square, old and defunct cannon point helplessly out to sea. On the opposite side there is a clear view of the harbour and yacht basin of Monte Carlo. On this warm, velvet night, a tourist group watched a mime performing in the square, while others gazed out at the twinkling, flood-lit harbour. James Bond did more than gaze. He stood looking down on the harbour, feet planted apart as though he stood on the bridge of a warship, a large pair of night glasses glued to his eyes. These were far from ordinary night glasses, but another product of Q Branch's fertile imagination. Not only was the image quality enhanced to a point where, at this moment, he could have been standing next to the couple in his sights, but also the binoculars contained the ability to photograph the exact scene onto which he was zeroed. The resulting pictures stored immediately on a small computer disk within the center section of the glasses. Down among the berthed yachts, he had two people in close-up. The slim and dark Xenia Onatop and her admiral, who, to Bond, looked incredibly like the long-ago murdered Tsar Nicholas. Admiral Farrell was handing the delicious and mysterious Xena into a motor launch. Bond pressed the camera button twice, once for the Admiral and once, full face, for Onatop, then a third time for the insurance. He moved slightly to focus in on the stern of the launch, magnifying the name Manticore. The launch, leaving a white trail of foam behind it, sped from the jetty, heading out towards a sleek and very expensive yacht at anchor in the harbour. Bond waited a few minutes, examining the other ships visible inshore and in the harbour. Among them, he noticed the lines of a French warship. This last had a long stern, which was almost completely taken up by a large helicopter. In silhouette, the machine looked dark and full of menace. Something in the back of Bond's mind stirred, half surfaced, then again retreated from his memory. He pushed it away. If you cannot recall something immediately, it probably is not worth remembering anyway. Meanwhile, he had things to do. The walk down from the rock took him some 10 minutes, so within a quarter of an hour he was behind the wheel of the DB5, growling out of Monaco again and heading high up into the foothills. Eventually, he parked just below the ancient village of La Turbie, with its Roman ruins and monument. It was the place, they had told him, where he would get the best possible reception. Turning on the radio, he quickly unloaded the little computer disk from the binoculars, slid it into a slit to the right of the CD player, and pressed one of the preset radio buttons. There was an almost imperceptible whine as the data was read from the disk and carried to London via satellite. It took 10 minutes, almost to the second. The radio crackled, and he heard the voice of Moneypenny, who, in spite of her long association with the old M, had agreed to see the recently appointed chief through the first difficult months in charge. Transmission begins. Bond smiled as her slightly breathy voice came clearly into the car through its 8 speakers, and at the same moment a fax began to emerge in full colour from the CD slot. The first photograph was of Xenia. Moneypenny kept up her running commentary. ID confirmed. Onatop Xenia, former Soviet fighter pilot. Worked for a year, just before the 91 coup, as a general pilot for KGB. Current suspected link with the St. Petersburg Janus crime syndicate. Next came his shot of Chuck Farrell. ID confirmed. Rear Admiral Charles Chuck Farrell, U.S. Navy. Distinguished career as an expert in the use of naval helicopters. Career marred only by rumours of constant womanizing. Was cleared of several charges during the now infamous Tallyhook scandal in 1993. Is in Monaco with a number of US Navy personnel gathering for a top-secret demonstration. Last came the name Manticore on the rear of the motor launch. Yacht Manticore is on lease to a known Janus Corporation front. M authorizes you to observe subject Onatop, but not, repeat not, to make contact without M's personal authority. End transmission. She had stressed the word contact as though it were a code word for something more interesting. The Janus crime syndicate was, he knew, the most ruthless of the organized Russian mafia families that had become more deadly than anything conceived during the last days of the Soviet Union. Janus was the scourge of the new Russia, and one of the reasons why Bond held to the theory that eventually it would be business as usual within the shrinking borders of the once evil empire. It was time, he thought, to pay a visit to this yacht, Manticore, something that was easier said than done. The main stateroom of Manticore was overtly designed for physical pleasure. It was a relatively larger cabin with an ensuite bathroom big enough to sport a jacuzzi, and wall fittings that contained colourful bottles full of brand name oils and unguents, including those sensual, edible oils sold as sexual aids. The ones that came in various flavours which enable partners to lick them from each other's bodies. The walls were decorated with erotic paintings and drawings, culminating with a huge oil directly over the bed, depicting, in all its detail, a modern view of a Roman orgy. The lights were dimmed, and there was a scent of musk in the air, while from some hidden source came a soft, lush melody played on what sounded like 1,000 strings. On the bed itself, late on this warm and luxurious evening, Xenia Onatop coupled with Admiral Chuck Farrell, who was slowly understanding that he had never had it so good. She had taken control almost before locking the door to the stateroom and telling him that nobody would disturb them. She had stripped him, pushed him back onto the great bed, and said, "For this one night, Chuck, I want you to enjoy me fully. Think of me as the ultimate pinnacle of your sexual dreams." She had slowly undressed for him, gently revealing her body, not in the vulgar grind of a striptease artist, but with the flair and professionalism of a ballerina. Each movement seemed to have been choreographed just for him, and at last, when she was totally naked, she came to him, whispering in his ear, rousing him almost to a frenzy, helping him, instructing him as a perfect body slave, until he became pliable, and left with a sense that he owed her a great sexual experience. It was then that she began a true domination of him, straddling his body and riding him, goading him onwards until their sweat mingled and he was completely at her mercy. He cried out as he reached his summit for the 3rd time in 2 hours, and as he did so, she made a quick, subtle movement with her thighs, flipping him over so that he lay face downwards on the bed. With soft, soothing words, she began to wrap her strong legs around his body, moving slightly so that eventually she held him in a scissors grip, her thighs wrapped around his chest, slowly loosening and tightening her hold, in a manner which made him gasp with pleasure, until she suddenly began tensing the muscles as though she were attempting to draw his entire body into hers. He gasped and cried out, "Xenia, no! I can't breathe! No!" It was doubtful if she even heard him, as she flexed the muscles even tighter. This was the technique of a boa constrictor, and she felt the bones crack in his chest, with half her mind registering the inevitable crunching horror of ribs crumbling. At the moment of his asphyxiation, Xenia Onatop cried out in her own final and conclusive orgasm. "Yes! Ah! Yes! Yes! Oh, yes!" It was a technique she had used many times during her life, and her masters knew how effective she could be. A secret weapon, like a spider who consumes its mate after the sex act. She swayed to and fro, still rubbing herself against his corpse, moaning and supremely satisfied in her moment of glory. She flicked the dead body onto its back, then slowly unwound herself, as though woken from a trance by the soft knock on the stateroom door. She opened up, unconcerned about her nakedness. A familiar figure stood in the doorway. "The spider and the admiral, huh?" the man said, as he gently took her in his arms and rocked her as one will lull a child into comfort or sleep. Bond had already taken the small sailing boat along the coastline. 2 days before, when M's representative, Caroline, had demanded that he should show her his proficiency with the little craft, which he had rented together with the tiny villa right on the shoreline near Cap Ferrat. In the early hours of that morning, he prepared for another journey, showering first with scalding water and then with an ice-cold needle spray. He toweled himself down roughly and went through his exercises, the sit-ups and push-ups that were his normal routine first thing in the morning. The fact that he had been awake all night made no difference, for tomorrow was now, and it helped his discipline to act as though he had just risen from a deep and long sleep. He had, in fact, taken a cat nap lasting for less than an hour. Over the years, he had learned the art of sleeping, even on his feet, for an accurate amount of time. Drawing from this new energy as though he had taken a full 8 hours of refreshment. He shaved and dressed. Slacks, a white Sea Island cotton shirt, soft espadrilles, and a blazer. In his usual time, then went through the small living room into the tiny kitchen, where he carefully cooked his normal breakfast, or near enough his normal breakfast. The best meal of the day, and the most important, he always considered. The coffee was not his much-beloved De Bry, brewed in an American Chemex, but it was near enough, and brewed in an earthenware jug. He had managed to lay his hand on some Cooper's vintage marmalade. whole wheat bread for his toast, and eggs very similar to the ones from French Moran's hens. Unhappily, there was none of the deep yellow Jersey butter, but he found the local variety very much to his taste. He took his time over the 2 cups of coffee. The egg boiled for exactly 3 1/3 minutes, and his slices of toast. He sat for a full hour after eating. It was now almost 4 o'clock in the morning, and the day ahead promised some action, though that niggling little worry had remained hidden at the back of his head. He had returned to it time and again during the night, but it remained as elusive as a 4-leafed clover. Before leaving the villa, he packed and readied himself for a fast getaway, for he was reasonably certain that, whatever lay in store for him today, M was likely to summon him back to London before long. Eventually, he went down to the short wooden jetty and made ready to cast off. He wanted his timing to be as accurate as possible, for he planned to hide in plain sight among the other yachts and small craft, which usually dotted the waters around Monte Carlo from first light. Joining the pleasure seekers and lotus eaters of the area, he would simply be one small craft among many. It was after 5 in the morning when he finally cast off and set a course out to sea, for he wanted to sail in a wide circle, coming inshore only at the last moment. The trip was uneventful, and, as expected, he found himself in the company of yachts, sailboats, and motor launches by around 9:30. Manticore rode at anchor in the same position as she had done during the previous evening, so he circled the long, sleek, sea-going yacht at a distance, his eyes raking the ship for signs of life. By 9:45, he saw the tender being readied on the starboard side, the side nearest the harbour exit to the sea. He also noted that Manticore had a second small motorboat in the water, riding off the stern. Gently, he manoeuvred his craft around to the port side, bringing her close in to the yacht, which had a line draped over the side amidships, presumably to be ready should the tender or motorboat decide to come inboard on the port side. He grabbed at the line and took the strain. It was firmly secured on the deck and strong enough for him to climb with no difficulty, so he tied up his own little sailboat and heaved himself up the curving flank of Manticore, nimbly vaulting over the rail, stopping still and silent the moment his feet touched the deck. He could hear the sounds of orders being issued, and the grumble of the tender's engines from the starboard side. Whoever crewed the vessel was well occupied over there, so he slipped forward, heading towards the main saloon. Inside, the saloon was decorated with style, and its fittings and furniture were there for comfort. A long bar taking up the length of one side, deep leather armchairs scattered around the entire room, which stretched the width of the ship. Paintings of obvious value were set under lights on the walls, and there was a wide passageway running from the saloon forward on the port side. Silently, Bond moved along the passage until he came to an ornate, solid carved wooden door. Gently, he tried the handle. The door swung open and he slipped inside, closing it behind him. He was in a bedroom given over to sensuality, a mirrored ceiling, erotica on the walls, and the scent of death reaching his nostrils before he saw the shattered body on the bed. The ports were open, but the incoming breeze did nothing to disperse the odor he had smelled too many times in his life. And there, sprawled hideously on the bed, was the naked and broken body of Rear Admiral Chuck Farrell. In death, his face was not in repose. The eyes were fixed on his reflection in the mirror above the bed, his mouth contorted in a wide-open grimace, as though he had died in some kind of revolting ecstasy. There seemed to be music drifting into this bizarre scene, and it took a moment for Bond to realize that it was floating in from the French warship he had noted, both last night and on his way into the harbor that morning. He could see the ship dressed overall through one of the ports. He could also see Manticore's tender rapidly crossing the stretch of sea towards the French ship. And in the tender were two people, Xenia on the top and the Admiral, who lay dead in front of his eyes. The band on the French naval vessel was playing a selection of sea shanties, and, as he peered out, he saw the outline of the helicopter. In that moment, the fact for which his mind had been searching since the previous night came into focus. He felt the blood drain from his face, and his lips automatically formed one word. Tigre. Of course, he whispered to himself as all the pieces slotted into place. Of course, Tigre. He did not even hear the door open behind him as his brain made several lightning calculations.